Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place, and the Disuniting of America by Nicholas Jacobs and Daniel M. Shea, narrated by Stephen Bowlby. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. The house had gone to bring again to the midnight sky a sunset glow. Now the chimney was all of the house that stood, like a pistol after the petals go. The barn opposed across the way, that would have joined the house in flame had it been the will of the wind, was left to bear forsaken the place's name. No more it opened with all one end, for teams that came by the stony road to drum on the floor with scurrying hooves and brush the mow with the summer load. The birds that came to it through the air at broken windows flew out and in, their murmur more like the sigh we sigh from too much dwelling on what has been. Yet for them the lilac renewed its leaf, and the aged elm, though touched with fire, and the dry pump flung up an awkward arm, and the fence post carried a strand of wire. For them there was really nothing sad, but though they rejoiced in the nest they kept, one had to be versed in country things not to believe the Phoebes wept. Robert Frost, The Need of Being Versed in Country Things. Preface. The idea for this book probably emerged after some pleasantly distracting conversation about maple sap, cider making, chickens, or the long list of things we needed to do to get ready for winter. Since we met at Colby College in the autumn of 2019, we have spent too much time wasting away the productive hours of our days talking about our little slice of heaven here in rural Maine. We are a tad unusual for academics in that regard. Our colleagues like to joke that we have gone native, but both of us have found connections to rural areas and rural people, even as we have followed our academic careers to different parts of the country than where we grew up. At the end of the day, we wrote a book on rural America because there is much we love and admire about rural life. There is something truly special about rural communities. Sure, living out in the country takes its toll, and our urbane colleagues and students often scratch their heads with wonder as to why we would ever put up with frozen septic tanks, hauling cordwood, the lack of good takeout, all the driving, and, more than anything else, all those Trump voters. To a point, we've asked ourselves the same things. Why would we live such different lives, and alongside people who seem to have such a different view about what type of leader this country needs? We have lived the rural-urban divide, a divide that took on an even more tragic dimension with the spread of COVID-19. We saw farmers struggle when they were unable to get migrant workers because the border had shut down. We talked with so-called non-essential laborers who had never missed a day of work in their lives. We struggled to make sense of why our neighbors dismissed the severity of the disease as it ripped through places like New York City, and then refused to get vaccinated just as the pandemic was wreaking its worst havoc on rural communities. Inevitably, the conversation would pivot to something Trump did, or the idiocy of something Biden said. And yet, where others would end the conversation there, seeing it as nothing more than a cult of personality, naked partisanship, or stubborn irrationality, we suspected something else was going on. We have no desire to make excuses for our neighbors, but in the early days of trying to piece this all together, we quickly realized that the image we had been given of the rural voter was not the one standing before us. No doubt the disconnect had much to do with the pictures of rural America we carried in our heads from growing up alongside rural people. Nick remembers the old dairy farmers at church talking about the days when cows would break free and run down Main Street. But as the suburbs rapidly crept over western Virginia, his mother was having to drive him to the ever-moving hinterlands to pick up hay for their rabbits and find eggs to incubate. Rural Virginia seemed like a lost idea when the last working farm in town was paved over the year after he left for college in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which was booming at the other end of the state's steady march toward suburbanization. Fortunately, Nick feels it will be a long time before someone even thinks about plopping a subdivision in Vassalboro, Maine. Any developer should be scared off by the sounds of his rooster, which starts the day for many of his neighbors on the Priest Hill Road. Dan was raised in rural upstate New York. His roots were planted deeply in the rocky soil of the northern Catskills. Daily life was in a small town, but escapes to old farms and woodlots to fish and hunt with brothers, cousins, and uncles were recurrent. His dad taught him the grandeur of a 12-inch native brook trout, and his mom the magic of loons at dusk. A connection to an extended rural family was cemented most weekends when all would gather on Bowers Hill, just up the road from Roscoe, for big Sunday dinners, tall tales, and family gossip. Over the years, he's moved between a few rural college towns and now spends his leisure time with his wife and kids gardening, tapping maple trees, and fly fishing in the great woods of northern Maine. In its rapid disappearance and our constant search to remain connected to the land and its people, we both value what Robert Frost described as the country things. Of course, the simple interpretation is that there are just things one learns about living in rural parts. Felling trees, picking off garden-meddling groundhogs, the fun stuff. But we know that it is much more than that. A mindful disposition about what matters, a careful reflection about nature and its awesome power over us, a commanding sense of stewardship for the land and the people who call it home. Frost wrote the poem 3 years after the U.S. Census announced that, for the first time, a majority of Americans lived in urban areas. Would they, he wondered, learn the same lessons living a city life? Would they develop the sense of humility and love of place that keeps us grounded and oriented to larger purposes? And then, we wonder, could one ever imagine finding such sentiments in a campaign speech by Donald Trump, a man who made his career paving over the country things we hold dear and commercializing on his urbane pride? Humble, frugal, and outward-looking, if that is what rural means to us, why did so many of our rural neighbors see this guy as their salvation? Worse still, that is surely not the image we got from all the news reports and flyover commentary in the aftermath of 2016. Rural people were mad, loud, primed for a rebellion. Maybe they no longer valued the country things. J.D. Vance told us of their homes being ripped apart by drug addiction and job loss, communities in disarray. Others pointed to all those whites in the countryside who hated immigrants and wanted to keep them out of the country. Maybe Thomas Frank was prophetic when he told us about how the yokels had been hoodwinked in Kansas when Republicans stormed into power by stoking fears of abortion, same-sex marriage, and women working outside the home. At every step of this long journey, we have been more than ready to confront the grim reality that the rural America of our past and our mythology has disappeared, and that, in its place, we have come to live alongside people chronically depressed, irredeemably racist, and culturally backward. But that is not what we discovered in writing this book. The country things are still to be found in rural America, but you need to know where to look. Introduction to Americas. Sometimes it feels as if we live and work in two different countries. The drive into Waterville, Maine, home of Colby College, is just 25 minutes for each of us. On the road, we pass familiar sights: kids at bus stops, hayfields, maple groves, duck blinds, a tractor here or there, junk cars. In Waterville there is, as our students remark, a glimmer of civilization. Stores, restaurants, new EV charging stations, construction everywhere, especially in the revitalization of downtown. In the small village of Vassalboro, you know summer has arrived when American flags can be seen hanging from every telephone pole in town. Near Mount Vernon, the farm stands are open, and the first cut of hay lies drying in the sun. One of us lives right down the road from a defunct wool mill, so old that it had made uniforms for Union soldiers, and where every Saturday a handful of farmers meet on the green out front to sell fresh veggies and talk of winter on the horizon. The other lives in the Belgrade Lakes region, the land of pointed firs and granite shorelines, an ancient summer retreat for Bostonians looking to escape the heat for 2 weeks of serenity out on the pond. And then there are the Trump flags, hung next to Old Glory on porches, draped over tents at the farmers' markets, fixed to the backs of pickup trucks, sometimes alongside Confederate flags, even though we're 600 miles from Gettysburg. And the bumper stickers, "Make liberals cry again," "Trump, no more bullshit," "Keep America great." Bright red MAGA hats sit on dashboards. Up the road, one farmer put up a new cattle barn, but before the siding went on in November 2020, he emblazoned "Trump 2020 on the paneling. Homemade billboards are spread out across front lawns and seem to hold up the sides of old sheds. "Don't blame me, I voted for Trump. Let's go, Brandon." And then, as you cross the bridge into town, they all disappear. Driving through rural America, you would think there is nothing more important in our lives than Donald Trump. You may guess that we are obsessed, and plenty of images could confirm your suspicion that rural America is pissed off. You may have read that rural America is anxious about immigrants. You may have listened to economists tell you that rural America is falling behind and doesn't know how or want to catch up. You may be sitting there thinking, of course they voted for Trump and watch Fox News incessantly. What else are they to do? It's so boring out there. But when we talk to our neighbors, it is hard to believe that someone like Donald Trump could be so popular. Sure, when looking at voting returns, it's very clear. Trump ruled over rural America in 2016 and 2020. But why is that true? An ethically challenged businessman who seems to caricature the glitz and glamour of jet-setting Manhattan luxury, how on earth did he become the voice of rural America? Sure, there are racists, homophobes, sexists, the deplorables, out here in the countryside, but they're everywhere in America. Can that really explain why rural America is so supportive of Trump and Republican candidates down the ballot? We do not ask these questions just because we are rural residents. As social scientists, we also find these images ironic because both of our rural communities, by any objective measure, are doing better than the grisly old town of Waterville. Median incomes are higher, the schools are better rated, home vacancy is practically non-existent, drug crimes are lower. And while Waterville has a Republican presence, Donald Trump's luster loses its sheen once you enter town. In this urban hamlet, he netted just 35% of the vote in 2020. The intensity of Republican partisanship and the ubiquity of Trump support in rural America has become a basic fact in contemporary American politics, a common talking point among pundits since the 2016 presidential election. In the days after Trump's shocking victory, analysts learned the correct pronunciation of sparsely populated counties in western Michigan and central Pennsylvania. Producers scrambled to get the inside perspective from recovering county dwellers who could speak to the bigotry, desperation, and collapse of communities primed for Trump's harsh rhetoric and nativist appeals. Collectively, we have learned much about how the other half, actually the other fifth, lives, and the rural-urban divide is now one of the most important ways for making sense of the country's intense partisan acrimony. We have seen countless stories of Appalachia in disarray. Pills, closed mines and factories, and crumbling infrastructure left communities primed for the anger and populist message of someone like Trump. Media portray rural voters as desperate. Left-leaning writers talk about how Republicans can distract simpletons in rural Kansas with tales of the abortion doctor gone rampant and teachers peddling critical race theory. Racist, backward-looking, uneducated, and poor. In retrospect, they say, it seems obvious how Trump could take hold in these places. From our perspective, the picture painted by these memoirs and journalism is, at best, simplistic, and more often, just plain wrong. It is undeniably true that rural America supports Trump, as true as it is that Republican candidates have courted rural voters and brought them into the party fold over the last 40 years. Whether they are Republican, Democrat, journalist, or campaign strategist, everyone seems to look to the hinterland and say, there's the real America. Of course Republicans are going to do well there. It's simple. But while rural life may be at times simple, its politics is anything but. We are told that rural America's support for Trump exists simply because voters there are whiter, older, and less likely to have a college degree. One perspective is that there is nothing special per se about ruralness. The rural-urban divide is just another part of America's racial, ethnic, and generational divide. And yet, white rural Americans behave differently than whites living in urban and suburban places. They do not share the same universe of opinions, even if they voted for the same Republican. Even non-white residents of rural places seem to have a different relationship with government than racial and ethnic minorities living elsewhere. On closer examination, ruralness is not, in fact, reducible to whiteness. Geography matters. Likewise, rural America is undeniably poor, and the economic livelihood of many rural communities has withered with globalization, free trade, and the move to an information-centered economy. But rural America is not all poor. There is a middle class, and there are even deep pockets of wealth. One story that's often told is that the downtrodden and economically dislocated are enraged, ready to embrace Trump and other firebrand Republicans. But even if rural America is poorer, and therefore more likely to vote for populist candidates, its citizens are not that much poorer than those in other parts of America, which are also suffering economically. Income inequality plagues all of America, and over the last 40 years, it has increased the most in urban areas, not the countryside. If you had to choose, would you rather be poor in Hannibal, Missouri, or on the streets of San Francisco? Why are only some of the poor drawn to Trump? And why are those doing just fine in rural areas voting for him too? Maybe it's the quality of public services in rural communities. Sure, some schools in rural America are closing, but shiny new regional educational campuses are springing up in many communities. Has government turned its back to rural Americans? Rural America is older and sicker, but it also receives a disproportionate share of government funding to shore up its healthcare system. Nearly 1 in 4 non-elderly rural residents is on Medicaid. Even if politicians like to yell that they are not getting their fair share, many are quick to point out that rural residents are no more or less deprived than their fellow Americans living elsewhere. Are there really 2 Americas, a rural America and an urban America, or is it all just a picture in our heads? Getting the story right matters. These days, when sharp partisan leanings are added to the mix, objective assessments can become, well, muddled. The best route is to rise above gut feelings, snapshots, and narrow assessments and test where our assumptions are backed by any shred of evidence. That is what we present to you in the following sections. Over the past 3 years, we have pulled together one of the most comprehensive and data-driven accounts of rural politics that exists. We created one of the largest historical data sets on voting patterns in the United States going all the way back to 1800. We combine these statistics with centuries-old census reports and other leading economic and community data providing an unparalleled look at what has taken place in rural America. Next, we scoured existing surveys all the way back to 1936 and conducted 3 of our own polls. The Rural Voter Survey Project boasts more than 10,000 survey interviews with rural voters and 4,000 with non-rural residents. It is fair to say that our conclusions rely on the culmination of more hard data than any other work on the dynamics of rural politics. It is why our story is different than the one you have heard. So the story goes. Turn on the TV on election night, and you would be hard-pressed to argue that there is not a deep and widening chasm in America. You know the maps, the vast field of red crossing the heartland and wrapping around the pockets of deep blue. It certainly looks like 2 Americas, but has it always been this way? And at first glance you would be right. When it comes to recent voting trends, rural America is solidly red. And yet, the rural-urban divide has not always been central to American politics. Rural America has traditionally divided its loyalties. In 1936, 4 years into Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, rural areas in the upper Midwest enthusiastically endorsed the Democratic president. In the same election, rural areas in the Northeast gave its opponent, the Republican Alf Landon, equally large margins. For more than 100 years, the most rural parts of the region were solidly Democratic, while most rural areas outside the South during the same time were either a partisan mix or heavily Republican. And it was only 50 years ago, during the 1970s, that some of the most progressive members of Congress hailed from rural areas. In 1972, the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency was arguably one of the most liberal candidates in its history. Our students are stunned to learn that George McGovern was from South Dakota. That is not what the American political landscape looks like today. And even though the 2016 presidential election was a nail-biter, in most parts of the country, it wasn't even close. Hillary Clinton won 199 counties by 60% or more, and Donald Trump won a staggering 2,035 counties by an equally steep margin. Most voters lived in sorted communities, where their neighbors primarily voted one way. Only 1 of every 3 rural voters cast a ballot for Hillary Clinton, and the more rural the community, the worse she performed. Just 25% of rural voters living in the least sparsely populated parts of the country voted for the Democrat. What seemed lopsided in 2016 proved to be just the start. 4 years later, in Tennessee, for example, Trump boosted his support by 21% in the towns and rural counties outside the state's big cities. The same thing happened in Michigan. There, some 5.5 million voters went to the polls, the highest percentage of eligible voters in 60 years. Turnout in urban Democratic strongholds was robust, but in the rural areas, Trump's margin of victory was enormous. In nearly all the counties south of Grand Rapids, Trump garnered at least 70% of the vote. In many of these areas, he topped 80%. The same dynamic has played out across the country. Turnout in metropolitan areas was high enough to push Biden over the finish line, but the margins netted by Trump in rural areas were unprecedented, and it spread down the ballot. In Iowa, Democratic Representative Abby Finkenauer came to office in the 2018 blue wave, but in 2020 she lost her re-election, likely due to Trump's huge margin in her district, which went from 15 points over Clinton in 2016 to 21 points over Biden. In North Carolina, Trump offset Democratic gains in urban areas by building on already impressive numbers in one rural county after another. In Columbus County, for example, he netted an additional 2,400 votes beyond his 2016 returns. There are many ways to define rural, a topic taken up in the next chapter. But in places with fewer than 500 residents per square mile, Biden received just 26% of the vote on average. The hemorrhaging of Democratic votes in rural areas affects nearly every aspect of American government. According to one analysis, in 2006, congressional voters in rural areas roughly split their votes between Republican and Democratic candidates. By 2022, Republicans claimed a whopping 68%. The transformation of governorships and state legislatures has been equally dramatic. When Ronald Reagan trounced Jimmy Carter in 1980, Democrats controlled 29 state legislatures. Republicans had only 15, and the other 6 chambers were split. After the 2020 election, that figure was nearly reversed. Republicans controlled 30 state legislatures, compared with the Democrats' 18. Overall, about 54% of state legislators are Republican, but the gap is vast in states with the largest rural populations. In many of these states, the ratio of Republican to Democratic state legislators is upward of 4-1, and the few Democratic legislators always come from the urban areas of the state. Competitive general election contests in rural areas have evaporated. GOP candidates often run unopposed. As to the number of Democratic state legislators from rural districts in any state, let's just say they could hold a convention in a phone booth. But why did this happen? The image is clear, but the story of how we got here is not. And while there has been no shortage of offhand theories for the emergence of this unprecedented and destabilizing divide, most fall flat when subjected to some basic facts. Of course, one character looms large in current explanations of the rural-urban divide: Donald Trump. By far the most common way to think about the rural-urban divide in popular media is to lean into the idea that something about Trump made him irresistibly popular in rural areas. Nobody really understood rural voters before Trump, they say. Want to do well in rural America, they ask? Act like Trump. Thousands of Election Day post-mortem interviews in the heartland showed how Trump's brash personality resonated in hard-scrabble rural America. As one rural voter summed it up, Trump, he don't take no crap. Although initially critical of Trump when promoting his book Hillbilly Elegy, a best-selling account of poverty in rural Appalachia, J.D. Vance later embraced Trump and his persona when running for Senate in Ohio. Vance learned that rural Ohioans voted for Trump not because he was wealthy or famous, but because he was fighting for them. Politico put it best: Trump's election was the revenge of the rural voter. So the story goes. Without Trump, the rural-urban divide disappears. Except that the current rural-urban divide had been widening for decades, well before Donald Trump. As we will discuss in much greater depth, rural support for Democrats at all levels of government, from the presidency to the state legislature to local school boards, has fallen each year since 1980. Yes, rural America did not seem to have the same enthusiasm for Mitt Romney in 2012. There were no massive rallies and no flags draped over tractors. But Romney still clobbered Barack Obama in rural areas, as did John McCain in 2008. No presidential candidate has performed better in rural America than Trump, certainly. But when put into historical perspective, the increase in rural support for Republicans from 2012 to 2016 was not unusually high or unexpected, given the decades-long trends in rural partisanship. Trump may just have been the right guy at the right time, and the rural-urban divide may be just as much about love for Trump as it is about hatred for Democrats. Take Trump away, and the rural-urban divide remains huge. The rural-urban divide has deep historical roots, but some reduce it to differences in the types of people who live in rural areas, what social scientists call a composition effect. The rise of rabid Republican partisanship among rural voters is nothing more than a growing concentration of the type of person in rural areas. We know that rural voters, on the whole, are older, more likely to be white, and less likely to hold a college degree. Regardless of where someone lives, if they are white, they are most likely to vote for Republicans. If they're older, it is more likely they will vote Republican. Ipso facto, rural America is more likely to swing Republican.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?